My name is Kurt Moore, and I was actually born in 1956 at the Naval Hospital in Springfield, Virginia. Uh, uh, and the reason I was born there was because my father was chief of security at the chief of naval security at the Pentagon, and so that seemed to be the closest hospital, Fort Belvoir Army Hospital, actually. And so we moved shortly after my dad left the Navy in 1958 and moved to Rogers, Arkansas. And there was always puzzlement between me and my siblings why we moved to Northwest Arkansas out of all the places they could have moved to. And there were two reasons. The first being that it was midway between my father's family and my mother's family. My father's family was in Mountain Home, Arkansas, and they'd moved there during the Depression to work on the Bull Shoals Dam project. And my mother's family was out in the panhandle of Oklahoma, having lived through the Dust Bowl. And so Rogers, Arkansas was about halfway between my mother's family and my father's family. But the other reason I didn't find out till later was that my mother wanted to get the heck out of Washington, D.C., because this was the height of the Cold War. My dad worked at the Pentagon, and things were apparently getting pretty dicey then. And so they were looking for a place that if the bombs started flying, it was most likely to not get hit. And that came up as Rogers, Arkansas. And so we bought, or they bought a farm out east of Rogers on Old Highway 12. And I presume they did it with the knowledge that Beaver Lake was coming in, because we only lived there a couple of years before the Corps of Engineers bought us out. And the house is now currently under about 40 feet of water. And it was close to the Beaver Prairie Creek swimming area. And so we lived variously in town and on different farms as I was growing up, and went through the Rogers school system and Rogers High School and graduated there in '74, and did a couple of years at the University of Arkansas before dropping out, and went into, at the time, the second year that Northwest Votech in Springdale was open, and I took auto mechanics and graduated, and spent the next 20 some years working on cars. And then a position opened up at what was then Northwest Votech, but is now Northwest Technical Institute, for automotive instructor. And I put in for the job and got it. And so that was one of my welcome back Cotter moments, where I went back to the place I'd gone to school and graduated at. And I worked there for 7 years, and an opportunity in Huntsville opened up as a shop teacher there. So I went there and worked for 7 years. And then opportunity at Rogers High School, or Rogers Heritage High School, opened up. So I finished up my career 3 years there. So I had two welcome back Cotter moments, one at Northwest Technical Institute and the other at Rogers High School, which was also Rogers Heritage.
So what was Rogers High School like when you went back in the 70s?
Oh, it was completely different than what it would be now. For one thing, the old campus at what is now the Rogers Heritage site had open hallways. And so anybody could walk in on campus with no impediment at all. You didn't I'm not even sure you even had to check in with the office or not. And of course, when it was really cold or rainy out, you got cold and wet going from class to class because there was minimal protection. And the hallways, as I said, were open to the elements. So it was a completely different world back then. Well, the thing that got me actually interested in politics to begin with was I'm an avid motorcycle rider, and I got in with a group called ABATE, which stands for Arkansas Bikers Aiming Toward Education. And their big thing at the time was fighting the state helmet law for motorcycle riders. And we eventually successfully got it repealed, but a lot of what we were doing was contacting legislators, talking with legislators, getting them to sponsor bills, working with various municipalities for biker-friendly laws or ordinances. And so I eventually became president of our chapter of ABATE in Northwest Arkansas. And one of the members that was in our chapter was Jeff Moser, which was a Benton County Justice of the Peace at the time. And he said, I'm going to be hanging it up here in a few years. Are you interested? And I said, yeah. So he said, well, you probably need a little bit of experience. So I ran for a constable in my township, Yale Township, in 1996 with no opposition. And my job as a constable was to do absolutely nothing. And that's the way my neighbors liked it. And then when Jeff stepped down at the end of '98, I ran for his position and won the position. And I've been on the Quorum Court ever since. When I got on the court, it was very, very polarized. And most of it was centered around Sheriff Andy Lee. Half of the court was pro-Andy and half of the court was anti-Andy, and kind of went from there. And I remember Andy, when I was sworn in, and he was kind of introducing himself as as the sheriff, he said, and now I have my Quorum Court, which I take at the time to reference that he had several of his friends run for Quorum Court positions, and so he wanted to end up with a majority of Quorum Court members in his favor for whatever he was proposing, and he almost got it. Turned out there was a 7 or 8 to 7 split between his supporters and his detractors, so to say. And so basically everything on those first two terms on the Quorum Court revolved around who the person supported, either as a supporter or an opponent of Andy Lee.
So what was some of the stuff that was controversial with Andy Lee?
Well, just about everything to his detractors. The helicopter, they called it Andy's Air Force. They, at the time, we were transitioning from the old jail, which was basically attached to the historic courthouse, to the new jail, which was just being finished up. And so a lot of money was being proposed for different amenities to be added to the new jail. And so a lot of, or several of the Quorum Court members took issue with some of these amenities, saying that these were not necessary, that it was uh, uh, not money not well spent. And so it got pretty, I would say, pretty dicey between the supporters and the detractors of Andy Lee. Tempers raged, people were shouting. It could get really ugly at times.
So where did you land in this for or against pendulum with Andy Lee, with Sheriff Lee?
I was nominally against Andy Lee, but instead of just saying everything Andy does is bad or everything Andy does is good, I took a more nuanced view of it. For example, Andy was wanting more cars than what the Quorum Court was willing to give him. And so I worked with Major Nelson Erdman, which was right under the chief deputy. And so we worked a deal where we were buying used patrol cars from the Missouri State Highway Patrol. They ran the cars for 2 years, regardless of mileage, and sold them and bought new cars. And so we were able to please the faction that wanted to limit the money for patrol cars. Plus, Andy was able to get the cars that he wanted in the numbers that he wanted by working in that. So I tried to work with them as much as I could. And I suppose I was kind of a bridge between the Andy haters and the Andy supporters.
So you could be essentially the swing vote either way sometimes?
Very much so. Me and Tim Summers were probably the main swing votes on the court at that time.
Speaking of, talk about some of your other Quorum Court members, such as Tim Summers. Who were some of the ones you served with, and tell me about them?
Dodie Evans, who is, I don't even know if he's still alive, but he was the editor of the local Gravette newspaper. Cheryl Harbaugh, she was the chair of the committee of the whole at the time. Leo Lynch, he was a definite anti-Andy person. Marge Wolf, anti-Andy. So those are the ones that stand out. Well, shortly thereafter, and this is kind of attached to Andy in a way, the county judge that came in when I did, Dr. Kerry Anderson, was a definite anti-Andy person. And he brought in a couple of administrative assistants. The girl's name was Stephanie, and I don't remember the young man's name, but he became the first IT director in Benton County. And 1999 was okay, but things just completely blew up in 2000. Apparently, these individuals that he brought in with him that I just mentioned were getting into areas that were none of their concern. And I'm talking about the judges and the courts and the sheriff's office and other elected officials. So I don't remember the details of all of that at the time, but it came down to Robin Green, who was the Benton County attorney at the time, telling Judge Anderson that you either resign or we're going to prosecute you. And I'm not sure exactly what they were going to prosecute him on, but he went ahead and resigned. And so the Andy and pro and anti-Andy faction came out again. J. Travis Harp and Gary Black were pro-Andy. and Marge Wolf was against Andy, and they were both wanting the rest of Carrie Anderson's term. And it turned out that by one vote, Travis Harp became the interim county judge, and then later become the administrative assistant under Gary Black. But some of the other things that were going on at the time involved the planning board, and there was a large project out east of Rogers of wanting to build a large condominium project, like 20 stories tall or something like that. And so they had, the planning board had originally okayed it, and then it was appealed. And at the same time, there was, in my district, there was a rock quarry project that was under consideration. And there was a night, and I'm thinking 2004, where we had they mistakenly, in my view, put the two appeals on the same night. And we had a appeal board meeting at the NWAC, I don't remember the name of the center, auditorium, and it ran until 5:30 in the morning. So the group I was with and was helping represent didn't get their matter heard until about 3:30 in the morning. And so something like that would never happen in the current climate in Benton County. But back then, it was kind of the wild, wild west of Benton County becoming less of a rural county government and more of a urban county government.
You had said before that the court was mostly Republican when you were on there, and were the issues ever really partisan, or was it more urban city that?
I would say it was more urban city, because we had the whole spectrum of Republicans, some that would be more like Tim Summers, who was a conservative Democrat and served on the court until I think 2008. And then you'd have your firebrand hard right Republicans as well. But typically most of the JPs were somewhere clustered in the middle, either slightly liberal or slightly conservative, but mostly middle of the road. Pretty much as it is now, actually. Mostly we're dealing with budget issues and other issues that would be more like what you'd encounter in a city council, which is nonpartisan as well. Gary Black, in my opinion, came in, he had just retired from Walmart, and he was shirt sleeves executive, what I would call not a suit and tie executive. He had been in charge of distribution centers and other large infrastructure type duties with Walmart. And so he came into the court not ever having worked in government before. And so he figured, in my opinion, that as county judge, I'm the boss, and my way or the highway. And of course, the Quorum Court kind of at the time politely gave him the middle finger on that particular course. So he was pretty rough around the edges when he came in, but later became a very, very good county judge as far as I'm concerned.
So what were some of the things he did differently that made him become a better judge?
He looked for, he got to the point where he was looking for consensus with the Quorum Court before he jumped off the deep end on a project. One of his favorite things was to get halfway into a project and run out of money and said, well, we got to finish this project, but I ran out of money. And the Quorum Court says, well, you didn't come to us in the first place, so why should we give you more money to finish this project? And so later on, he would come to the Quorum Court first. I want to do this project. I'm going to need X amount of money, and let the Quorum Court go through the appropriation process before he got started on it. So that's one of the things that jumped out probably the most as being different between when he first came in. Dave Bisbee became county judge for one term, and I think was unfairly castigated for not being a very good county judge. But Dave Bisbee ran into a lot of issues right at the very first. The first thing that happened, and this was on his very day he was inaugurated, was that there was a major tornado on New Year's Day, one that wiped out the little town of Cincinnati south of Siloam Springs. And so there was some debris damage in Benton County as well. And so on his very first day in office, and then that was also the same year as the ice storm. And so he'd only been in, like a month and a half before we had this horrible ice storm, which crippled all of Northwest Arkansas for quite some time. And so he got a lot of static for doing, having contracts with firms to clean off the county roads, to cut up the trees, load them, and bring the debris to a burn pile, and also to have county residents clean up their property and place the debris right next to the county roads. So he got into a tussle with the Quorum Court at the time over that. And the second thing that Bisbee did that I think he didn't really get enough credit for was right at the time around 2008, Bella Vista voted to incorporate. And that was probably 15% of our sales tax revenue that we just immediately lost. Plus, we had the 2010 census, which was tied with the Bella Vista, was going to give us about a 20%, 25% reduction in revenue on our sales tax revenue. So what Bisbee did was in 2008, before all of these things happened, he had us reset the budget so that we had a very, very large surplus. And we did that for 2 years. And so when the expected loss of revenue hit, we were able to weather the financial turmoil, and we're able to get through it without any major problems. And in fact, our surplus that we currently have in the Quorum Court is directly attributable to Dave Bisbee's work at the time. I think the current Judge Barry Mooring is probably one of the best that we've had in my experience, because he has the managerial experience working for large corporations. And he spent 2 terms as a justice of the peace, so he knows how things are on the justice of the peace end of things. And so he can work with the Quorum Court a lot more effectively than most of the other county judges have in the past. I would say mostly he lets the court, he doesn't try to ram his desires down our throats, so to speak. He lets the Quorum Court go through the processes necessary to achieve what he is wanting done without undue interference on his part or undue lobbying on his part. One of his favorite lines is, this is your decision to make. I'll try to facilitate it in any way possible, but it comes down to you making this decision, and me and my staff are here to support you.
A lot of the county officials and others in the county have, their background with Walmart has been a big influence. How have you seen that has helped them, or how has that impacted some of the politicians, their background with Walmart?
Well, the previous county judge to Barry Mooring probably lost an election because he was wanting to put the courts complex out near the county jail and basically have the courts leave downtown Bentonville. And so the Downtown Bentonville Association, which is funded mostly by Walmart, said, cried foul on that. And I remember at the time that they gave Judge Mooring a very, very major campaign contribution, especially in light, most Benton County judges spent maybe 20 to 30,000 on a typical reelection campaign, and they gave Judge Mooring over 100,000. And so I would say that without denigrating Walmart, what Walmart wants for Bentonville and Benton County always is something to be considered, because if they fight against what it is you're trying to propose, say, for example, this jail expansion, it's never going to happen. So you have to get them on your side if you want to get anything meaningful passed in Benton County. Well, the largest issue right now is probably the jail expansion and moving the criminal courts out to the near the jail campus, as opposed to what we went through before. We were wanting to build a large court complex right off the square in Bentonville, and the voters resoundingly voted that down. So we are planning on leaving the non-criminal courts in downtown Bentonville and moving just the criminal courts so they don't have to bus defendants from the jail to the downtown area and then back, which obviously creates security issues. So we have a big uphill slog because that's probably the largest amount of money that we've ever asked for, over 200 million. And I see that Washington County is having pretty much the same issue, but this all has to do with Benton County's growth. And as we get bigger and bigger, our law enforcement presence and our courts and everything that's attributed to that will grow as well. And so hopefully that we can allow the voters to make an informed decision on this issue.
What changes have you seen out in the rural area where you live? So what are people seeing out in the county?
The area I live in is probably one of the most rural left in the county, although there's a large area west of Highway 59 and basically between Highway 59 and the Oklahoma border that's very rural as well. But I'm seeing, at least in my area, large ranch-style homes, in some case, multi-million dollar large ranch-style homes being built because the land prices are still relatively affordable, since it being mostly ag in my area. I think that the land prices have priced a lot of people out of what I call the strip between Springdale and Bella Vista. And so a lot of people are looking to find a more affordable alternative out in the unincorporated areas. It's been difficult trying to bring infrastructure out to these people, like rural water, for example. And I think that's going to be pretty much the trend. I think Bentonville and Rogers are going to continue growing westward more so than eastward. And I envision probably in the next 10 years that the area between Highway 59 and Interstate 49 being filled up with housing developments. I think, if anything, the growth is going to accelerate over what we currently have. It's been phenomenal growth that we've experienced, but I think that as the word gets out more and more about Northwest Arkansas, that it's going to grow even more. It's going to be very difficult for the county or the leaders in the cities and the Northwest Arkansas Council and the planning or various planning boards to accommodate this growth. Well, Benton County is kind of in a unique position politically as cities become larger and larger. They tend to become more and more left-leaning or liberal, for lack of a better word. But Benton County and Washington County, Northwest Arkansas area is different in regard to you have several similar sized cities. You have Bella Vista, Bentonville, Rogers, Springdale, and Fayetteville. So you really don't have a urban center to speak of. Most of the amenities that you find in Fayetteville are also available in Rogers and Bentonville. And so you have Rogers, Bentonville vying with Springdale and Fayetteville as the urban leaders. And so you don't have one urban center like you would Tulsa or Dallas or Oklahoma City, where you have satellite towns clustered around. So it's interesting watching the dynamics of the Northwest Arkansas cities as they expand and vie for dominance in the area.
If someone came to you, say, that wasn't from, never been to Benton County, maybe from another state or another part of the state, and said, Kurt, tell me about Benton County, what would you tell them?
Say it's one of the most interesting areas between rural and urban mix that you're probably going to find. There's very few places in the United States that you can drive 10 miles from an urban center and be out in the middle of the country. It's interesting that Benton County is one of the, if not the largest ag producer in the entire state, while also having one of the largest urban areas. if someone was wanting to move here, I would say that there's a good balance between small town and big city. And places like Bentonville especially are, with the help of the Walmart people, have a lot of amenities that you would only normally find in large cities.